Hi, this is Dr. Mercoli, and today I'm here with Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and we're just delighted and privileged to have him. We're going to talk about some very exciting topics, primarily related to the vaccines. And there has been a progressive increase in the use of vaccines over the last 20 to 30 years, and there's more on the way. And the big issue, of course, is, first of all, do they work? And then secondly, and more importantly, is how safe are they? And one of the most prominent researchers in answering that question with respect to the safety and any adverse effects that could be caused would be Dr. Wakefield. And we're going to discuss some of the studies that he's done. He's really one of the pioneer and probably the most prominent researcher in this area. And that's why we're so excited to have him. But this is literally a multi-billion dollar process of these vaccines, and largely because of the patented drugs being decreased, there's the big focus of the drug companies is to be increasing these use of the vaccine. So this is a really essential part of their role, and they are mounting massive efforts at discrediting anyone, especially a prominent researcher, who's attempting to counter the benefits, supposed benefits of vaccines. So while we start, I think probably the most important, because many people may not know who you are, if you can discuss what your academic credentials are, and let's start from there.
Certainly. Very, very nice to be here, Joe. I'm a physician. I trained at St Mary's Hospital in London, qualifying in 1981, and I went into surgery, became a gastrointestinal surgeon with an interest in small bowel transplantation and experimental interest.
How long is that residency?
That residency is about 8 years, 9 years.
That's after you graduate medical school?
That's correct.
Which is 4 years, after college?
That's correct.
Okay.
Well, in fact, in the UK, you go straight to medical school, so you do a 5-year medical school program, whereas in this country, you go to college, then you go on to medical school. So we get thrown, thrown into the deep end at an earlier stage. But and then
your training was at because many of our listeners are from the United States, it was one of the most prominent hospitals in the Europe, isn't that correct?
It's part of the University of London, which is the biggest medical school in Europe, yes. And then I went to Canada. I did a period on a Wellcome Trust traveling scholarship to look at small bowel transplantation. I went to the world's leading center, which was Toronto at the time. And then we made some discoveries, some observations there that led me into a research career when I came back to the UK and started working initially on the liver transplant program at the Royal Free Hospital, and then joined in with the gastroenterology team and continued from that point.
And what year was that?
Well, that must have been the end of the 80s, so that was sort of 87, 88.
Okay, great.
And my big interests at that time were Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and we made some interesting observations, published a great deal in those diseases, and have now published about 130, 140 peer-reviewed papers looking at the mechanism and cause of inflammatory bowel disease, and then of course latterly looking at how the brain and the bowel interact in the context of children with developmental disorders such as autism. And
how did you, what stimulated or triggered your interest in studying the area of developmental disorders and bowel disease? Because it isn't a necessarily intuitively obvious connection.
I had an interest in measles virus, and we'd published on the possible role of measles virus in Crohn's disease, in a subset of patients with Crohn's disease who'd been exposed to measles under unusual circumstances. And this work came from our group, it came from the Mayo Clinic, and it came from Sweden, from Dr. Ekbom in Sweden, showing that children who'd been exposed to measles under unusual circumstances were at greater risk of Crohn's. What do I mean by that? I mean kids who were exposed very early in life, in utero exposure, so they'd been exposed in the womb, then went on to develop Crohn's disease. So was it possible that for a common virus, an unusual pattern of exposure increased the risk? Now, one unusual pattern of exposure to measles is clearly vaccination. You change the route, the dose, the age of exposure, and the strain of the virus. So it's very unusual. Was that in part of the problem? And so we published a paper in The Lancet suggesting a possible link between the measles vaccine and later inflammatory bowel disease. And on the back of that, that paper came out in 1995 in The Lancet.
And the research was done in the early 90s, because it takes a while to compile the data, write the paper, and go through the peer review process.
And then we got a steady trickle of calls starting in May 1995 from parents saying my child was normal, they had their vaccine, the MMR, they regressed, they lost skills, they became autistic. I stopped them there. I said I know nothing about autism at all. you must have got the wrong department. And they said, but my child has got terrible bowel problems. They've got diarrhea 12 times a day, they're failing to thrive, they're falling off their growth charts, they've got a bloated abdomen. I know they're in pain, but they've lost the ability to speak. And so I have to infer that they're in pain, but they're banging their head against the wall, they're screaming episodes, they're waking at night.
The clue.
And these kids were sick. And so we said, well, we need to look at this. And we did. And it turned out that the parents were right.
Can you when you looked at it, that you evaluated, did a study, and you published the results of that study, those findings?
That's right. The way we went about this was, in a nutshell, we got a group of people, the best people in the world, in fact, Professor John Walker-Smith and his team, pediatric gastroenterologists, who were then at the Royal Free, a group of child psychiatrists, neurologists, pathologists, and we got this team of people together and said, how should we investigate these very complex children? They come to us, or their stories are so complex, they're clearly unwell. Child psychiatry, psychology has been unable to unravel this mystery. They've just labeled them with this behavioral disorder, and yet these children are physically, medically unwell. How are we going to resolve that? So we put this multidisciplinary team together. We went through a process of determining which tests should be decided. The clinicians decided on the clinical tests. I was more involved in the research side, to setting up the research tests. And we then went through a process of investigating a large number of children. By the time I left the Royal Free in 2001, we'd looked at over 170 children. And what was remarkably consistent about them is they had a subtle but definite inflammatory bowel disease. And when the clinicians treated the inflammatory bowel disease, then the bowel symptoms got better, but also the behavioral symptoms got better. And that was fascinating. Some children would start speaking. They would start speaking where they left off many years ago. They would smile. They would sleep at night. I think sleep was the first thing that came back. They started sleeping at night. And when we first did this, we said that didn't happen. Didn't happen. We did it again, happened again. Did it again, it happened again. It kept happening, and so we thought there's really something in this.
And what was the treatment that you used to address the bowel disease?
Well, initially it was just a simple sort of anti-inflammatory medication that we would use for Crohn's or colitis. So a sulfasalazine-like drug, or a 5-aminosalicylate.
So not really a natural therapy by any means?
No, well, I suppose you could argue that aminosalicylates are natural. I mean, they're produced by plants to reduce...
But traditionally viewed
absolutely. And the other thing that we found was most effective was the gluten casein-free diet. And this is something that the parents had instituted rather than us, but it was dramatic in many cases.
And you teased it out as a variable in your analysis.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we became very, very interested in this whole process. And when we presented it to psychiatrists, they said, I just don't get it. I don't get this gut-brain thing. This is a brain problem. Don't talk to me about the intestine. But as gastroenterologists, we saw this all the time. I worked on a liver transplant program. When patients became jaundiced, they became encephalopathic. Their brain stopped working. It started with the inability to join up dots on a page. Then they became more and more confused. Then they went into coma. Then they died. And the way you treated that, the way you prevented that, was to treat the gut. You treat it with antibiotics to get rid of the gut bacteria, a special diet. You put them on a regimen that cleans out the gut. And when you do that, then the encephalopathy goes away. They wake up again. And so we'd seen this before in a different setting.
Sure.
Jaundice, we'd seen it in celiac disease, an allergic sensitivity or an immunological intolerance of gluten. One of the presenting features of celiac disease can be dementia. It can be neuritis, inflammation of the nerves. It can be seizures. So these neurological complications of celiac, a primary bowel disease, were not new to us. So when we saw these children responding to a treatment for the gut in terms of getting better cognitively, then that was very, very interesting, but not alien.
Yeah, not surprised. Now, most of your research was done in the 90s. a good portion of the initial research. And this actually preceded the development of the explosion in knowledge about vitamin D. But now with vitamin D, there seems to be a very potent connection to inflammatory bowel disease and improvement of the immune system, because it stimulates the production of 200 to 300 antimicrobial peptides. So I'm wondering if, my guess is that you did not look at vitamin D, or maybe you looked at it later on. Is that something that's
No, we didn't. It's very, very interesting. This has emerged, as you say, since that time, but there's been a big, big emphasis on a very much an underestimated vitamin
something
over
as
the
simple as
years.
exposure to sunshine, the basics. So this sounds like a massive undertaking. You have loads of clinicians, large numbers of patients at a major university. It would seem that funding would be an issue. Who funded that project?
Initially, this was just the National Health Service. So these children were being seen according to clinical need. They were being referred by their doctors, and they were being treated according to the findings. So it was just a standard. There was nothing complicated about this, Joe. This is the thing, is why have these kids been missed in the past? This isn't rocket science. This is just the application of standard classical medicine. Listen to the parent, examine the child, do the appropriate investigations, and lo and behold, the answer is there. These children have an inflammatory bowel disease. Does it get to the root of their autism? No, not yet. Is it a start? Yes. Is it a good grounding in terms of understanding the biological basis of their complex disorder? Absolutely. And it all comes from listening to the parent's story and not dismissing it by saying, well, your kid's autistic, they're bound to have diarrhea 12 times a day. That doesn't make any sense at all. But that's what these parents were experiencing. Or one from America saying that went to the doctor and the doctor said, don't tell me about bowel symptoms, I trained at Harvard. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? That is absolute nonsense. So listen to the parents, act upon what they are telling you, and you will start to uncover the clues to this disorder.
That's a good strategy, and it's shockingly lacking in my experience in most of the physicians in this country, especially in the surgical profession, which is, you're a surgeon as your primary training, and I'm not sure why it is, and it's certainly not true of all, but there tends to be a greater percentage of surgeons who have this arrogant attitude, this like God syndrome, and they tend to follow that path and avoid listening to the patients and sort of impose their views without applying this. And it's really delightful to see that wasn't applied over on your side of the ocean. So
well, I'm afraid it does.
Yeah.
It's pervasive, and I've never met so many experts as I have in autism. Experts about a disease about which we know nothing. We know nothing, and yet we're surrounded by experts, and that paradox needs to be resolved.
All right, well, I'd like to discuss some of one of the reasons you're here today, because of your appearance in the media recently as a result of these studies that you just mentioned. The original study, which really highlighted you as one of the most prominent academic researchers in this area in the world. I mean, I don't know personally of anyone who has more prominence than you. Largely a result of your credentials and your training and working at one of the leading hospitals in the world, and then published in one of the leading respected journals. I mean, both of us strongly believe in the scientific method, that there's value in doing a piece of research under very specific criteria and then having it reviewed by peers objectively and then analyzing to see if it's true or not. I mean, that system works. And really forms the basis for much of what we apply and discuss. Unfortunately, it can be perverted, and we'll discuss that in a moment, by a number of different strategies, and specifically we'll discuss what happened in this case. But ultimately, that process is designed to ferret out the truth, and which is one of the reasons why you rose to prominence, because you had published in a peer-reviewed journal, Lancet, one of the top leading medical journals in the world, and they published your findings, and then you did additional findings, and you have 130 other papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. So you're one of the leading experts out there. So there are literally billions and billions, tens if not hundreds of billions of dollars involved here with the vaccine industry. That's a lot of money. So there's forces and pressure that would result. I mean, it's not surprising that we're going to counter any evidence or suggestion that there's something wrong with this system. That appears to be what's happened here. So recently, in the last few months, you've been criticized and bandied about in the media, and you really haven't shared your side of the story yet. This is the first time you're really publicly doing that, for reasons that you may discuss with us today. But I'd like you to address, sort of summarize what's happened.
Sure.
That, sort of viewers can understand that, and then counter some of the arguments that have been thrown against you and criticism, because it looks pretty bad if you just read the media report, but like every story, there's always two sides, and your side has never been told.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Joe, for the opportunity to tell it. The reason I've not been able to tell it is because I've been going through legal proceedings at the General Medical Council, which is our regulatory body for doctors in the UK. And so I've been chomping at the bit but unable to say anything. So it's a great time now to have the opportunity to say something. There have been a lot of criticisms, and I'm very happy to address any of those as we go through this conversation. But in a nutshell, what we did was to publish a case series. Now, a case series is an observational study. It's taking a look at a group of children or patients who have got a constellation of signs and symptoms and findings that bracket them together. There are similarities that mean they need publication. They're sufficiently novel and sufficiently interesting that they need publication in their own right. It's not a controlled study, it's simply a case series, so it tells the story, the clinical story of those children. Part of that clinical story was the bowel symptoms, and that led to the discovery of a novel bowel disease. And you would think that that would be a cause for some small celebration, but oh no.
Maybe
Why
even a
not?
Nobel Prize down the road.
I don't think so, but nonetheless. There was something that was treatable. For the first time in this disorder, you had something tangible, treatable, that you could really do something about. As a doctor, it should have been a cause for celebration, but no, because part of the parent's story in the majority of children was regression after a vaccine. Now, if those children had regressed after natural chickenpox, you and I would not be sitting here now. But they didn't. They regressed after a vaccine. Their parents weren't anti-vaccine. They took them to be vaccinated according to the schedule.
Sure.
And they said to their doctor, well, look,
everything appropriately.
After my child was vaccinated, they weren't well. They had a high fever for a week. They then became delirious. They then started losing their speech and language, this kind of thing. So it wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just that the child, at around the time children are diagnosed with autism or first present with autism, had their MMR. It wasn't that. There were medical events associated with the exposure that then subsequently led to the child's decline. And so we had to take that very seriously. The parents were right about the bowel disease. Were they right about the vaccine? And when we published in the Lancet the story, we weren't about to censor the story, weren't going to take out the bit about the vaccine, then things went very badly wrong. The other thing that's, when I decided that I was going to get involved in this, and I wasn't going to back away from it. Sorry, Joe, you were going to say something?
Well, when you said they went wrong, could you describe the sequence of what happened and what specifically went wrong?
Sure. Well, I decided that I was going to review all of the safety studies about measles and measles-containing vaccines, because if I was going to get into a fight, I needed to know what I was talking about. If I was going to challenge the status quo and say things that might have an adverse effect on vaccine uptake, I had to know what I was talking about. So I read all the papers, and I was appalled. I was absolutely appalled at the quality of the safety studies of the single and combined measles, the MMR vaccine in particular. And then I wrote to my colleagues in advance of the paper coming out, and I said, this is going to attract a lot of attention in the media. And I have to tell you that I have now read all these studies. I've written a 250-page report, which I'm very happy for you to read.
It's a book.
I cannot support the continued use of the MMR vaccine. I will continue vigorously to support the use of the single vaccine, but I cannot support the use of the MMR. Now, at that stage, the Dean of the Medical School, Larry Zuckerman, had decided that he was going to have a press briefing, a press conference, get people together, tell them about the findings of the study. And I wrote to him, I copied this letter to him, so he had an opportunity at this stage to say, no press briefing, we don't want to get into the vaccine issue, Wakefield doesn't attend the press briefing, or if the question is raised at the press briefing, it doesn't go to Wakefield. He had 3 opportunities to diffuse this. He didn't. As soon as the question came up at the press briefing, which inevitably it was going to do, he directed it straight to me. And I responded in exactly the same way that I said I would respond in advance of that press briefing. Now, it wasn't based upon the observations in 12 children. It was based upon reading all of the safety studies and producing a 250-page safety report on those studies, which I'd offered to my colleagues to read. And that was the basis for my recommendation that parents be allowed to use the option of the single vaccines.
And when did that press briefing occur?
That was in February 1989.
Okay.
Now, what happened then is at that time, single vaccines were still available in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I would not have made that recommendation. In the September of that year, the government withdrew the importation license for the single vaccine. So here was the demand at its maximum for the single vaccines. Parents still wanted to get vaccinated, their children vaccinated. I was encouraging the use of the single vaccine, but the government took away the option of single vaccines on the NHS from parents.
It's an important point, too, for our listeners and viewers, is that you weren't advocating not to vaccinate. You were encouraging people to vaccinate. You just said, let's get them singly, because from your review, exhaustive review, there appeared to be some complications when you combined them all together.
Yeah, we've got a problem here, and until that problem is resolved, children need to be protected, but give parents the option of the single vaccine. And they, the government, at the height of the requirement, the need, the demand for the single vaccine, withdrew that option. In other words, to protect the policy, MMR, and not protect the children.
So specifically a response to the concern you brought up.
Yeah. So here they are, the government putting, or the Department of Health, putting the concerns for the protection of the policy before concerns for the protection of children. Mm-hmm. So I'm afraid, it's my opinion, that it is entirely their responsibility that there has been a declining vaccine uptake in the UK because they've removed the option of the single vaccines, and there have been outbreaks of infectious disease as a consequence.
Okay. Interesting. So what happened after that? Because there's this whole series of events that really have gotten you to the media recently.
Yes, well then what happened was we went on and saw more children, published more papers. Mm-hmm. We published a total of about 19 papers on this disorder in total.
And they were all peer-reviewed scientific
all peer-reviewed, and strangely these have never been discussed. When it comes down to the public relations exercise of the other side to discredit, the only paper that is discussed is that Lancet paper.
And which Lancet paper is that?
That was the first, that was
very
the 1989.
First one, the original one.
They don't talk about the detailed characterization of the bowel disease that we went through, the look at re-challenge, what happened to kids who had not one shot but 2 shots of MMR. Were they worse than the kids who'd had 1 shot? All those sorts of things never get discussed.
If not tens of thousands of additional research that was done afterwards to document the original findings.
Absolutely.
Just absolutely not even addressed.
To extend them, and then they don't talk about the replication of the studies elsewhere around the world.
Not even your researchers, but other researchers.
Yeah, so it's now been replicated in Canada, in the US, in Venezuela, in Italy. They never get a mention. All you ever hear is that no one else has ever been able to replicate the findings. I'm afraid that is false.
But they can get away with that. It's amazing. They can say a false statement and get away with it.
Well, they've been doing that for a long time, I'm afraid, and they're past masters.
All right, so continue along the path to get us up to date where we are now, and then we'll kind of go backtrack and address some of the other issues.
Well, in the background, so this is the foreground. This is naively, here we are as academic researchers doing this work, thinking this is useful, and yes, it's contentious, but nonetheless it's very important. In the background, things were going on behind the scenes that we didn't know about. And what had happened is that the Department of Health had contacted my medical school, the dean in particular, and had tried to close this research down, had tried to close down the clinical care of children with autism at the Royal Free, expressing concerns that it was unethical, or these children had autism, it wasn't fair on them to go through these procedures. Were they justified? Well, here you had the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist and his colleagues saying, yes, they are justified, and here are the findings, and we're happy to show you the findings at any stage, in any venue that you like. But nonetheless, there was a concerted effort behind the scenes to stop the work. And it was particularly the concern of the Department of Health that there was pending litigation, that I had agreed to act as an expert in the litigation, giving access to these children to the process of justice, not trying to prove that it was right or wrong, but giving them, doing my best as an expert to determine whether there is a case in law against the vaccine manufacturers. And again, this was 1996, 97.
Okay. So still about 15 years ago.
Yeah. And I hope I'm getting the dates right here, but it's in 96,
around
97.
Yeah.
And so I had agreed to do that, and I wrote to my colleagues in '97 saying why I'd agreed to do it, saying that I felt there was a professional and moral obligation, because these children, when their parents die or become infirm, they're on the street. No one cares, and no one is going to look after them. And if society does not fulfill its absolute moral and professional and social obligation to look after these children, they're going to die on the street. And that's a fact, and it's already happened. So I felt very, very strongly that as a doctor looking at this, I had a duty to get involved in litigation. Now, what I thought at the time, and what the lawyers thought, is that it was the drug companies that were going to be sued. It wasn't. What had happened when the MMR was introduced in the UK is that somehow the Department of Health or the government had done a deal with the manufacturers of one of the vaccines, SmithKline-Beecham, to indemnify them against litigation. Now, why would they do that? What was the purpose of that? Well, it turns out that the vaccine that they had at the time contained a strain of the mumps virus, Urabi AM9, which was dangerous. It caused meningitis. It was first introduced, it was produced in Japan, it was introduced into Canada, and very quickly in Canada, when it came into use as MMR, they found that it caused meningitis. Rapidly after that, it was withdrawn. It was then withdrawn in Canada, and it was still introduced in the UK. And it's my opinion that SmithKline-Beecham did not want to introduce it because they knew of these problems. They had a potential liability, a real liability. And the government, therefore, in order to give the contract to the home team, to a British company, indemnified them.
And in the U.S., it requires passage of legislation through our elected officials. But do they require a similar process in the UK?
Well, I think a lot of that process was circumvented. For example, they relied on safety studies of the Merck vaccine, that is MMR2, which does not contain this dangerous mumps strain. It's a much safer vaccine.
So there's two other options that they had.
Absolutely.
But they weren't British.
They weren't British.
Yes.
One was French, one was American. And they didn't want to give it to that company for some reason. So rather than introduce, what they did is take those safety studies from America using a different vaccine and say, oh, it looks pretty good to us, therefore we can introduce this vaccine in the UK. You can't do that. You can't take one antihypertensive brand from one company and one in another and say, well, that's fine, so we're going to give that one a license, and that's what happened.
Well, you potentially could, because there's a lot more standardization into the structure of a drug. But for a vaccine, many of our viewers may not understand, it's a far different complex process involving biology and growing these cultures on tissue cultures, and extracting and contamination. There's so many other variables that it becomes, it's preposterous to even consider that.
Good, and particularly where you've got a brand of the vaccine where there have already been problems.
Yes.
So the vaccine with this dangerous Urabi AM9 strain came in the UK, and lo and behold, it had to be withdrawn 4 years later, overnight, because it was causing meningitis. It was causing the complication that had been seen in Canada, that had been seen in Japan, and had been seen in Australia. And the vaccine was withdrawn. Was it taken off the market? No. What happened to it next? It was put into storage. And then it was sent to third world countries like Brazil to be used in mass vaccination campaigns. So here you have a vaccine.
That's criminal.
That has been taken away from different countries, first world countries, but has not been discarded and is then sold on to Brazil. What happens when they do a mass vaccination campaign in Brazil? They have an outbreak, an epidemic of meningitis.
So were there any legal options that the individuals that were vaccinated over that 4-year period while it was still on the market, did they have any recourse at all?
Well, you would have thought they would have done, and that was part of what I was involved in. But that litigation was abandoned some years later in 2004, when it was quite clear to me that there had been problems. And what really provoked me into getting more and more involved in this is that a member of the Scottish Department of Health, a whistleblower, met me on Newcastle Station in the north of England, met with me and with the lawyers, and exposed this process. He said, I came from Canada. I came from Canada to advise the UK government on the introduction of MMR. I said, do not use this vaccine. They ignored me. I said, you have to have active surveillance for adverse events. You've got to go out and look for these adverse events because they are real in Canada and they may well be real in the UK. so you have to look for them. They ignored me. And they went ahead and they introduced this vaccine, and it, lo and behold, it had to be withdrawn. And so he felt very bad about this, and he knew, in his opinion, that children had been damaged, and he felt the need to expose this process.
That was in 2004, so 6 years later, still nothing has resulted from, no compensation or, I guess, reprimand or any other process that was directed at those responsible for making that decision.
That's correct. And it seems ludicrous to me, and it's now, therefore, time for this to be exposed. It's time to get this out there, because I'm no longer under this legal stricture that prevents me from doing so, and so it's coming out.
And there's going to be a few other surprises as we continue with the conversation. So we're up to 2004, so why don't we continue on the journey until we get to present
Well,
day?
between then and 2004, between the publication of the paper and 2004, I lost my job at the Royal Free. And there was a great deal of pressure to stop this work, and the new professor of medicine sat down with me and the secretary of the medical school, and he said, "You no longer form part of my plans for this department, the future of this department." He said, "Your science is not good." And I said, "It's interesting you should say that. Have you ever read any of the papers that we have ever published?" And he paused and he said, "I don't need to." I don't need to. There was some preternatural wisdom that he had been given from God, that he didn't need to read the papers. So we got into a little discussion about who was the bad scientist, and our relationship didn't improve from that point on. But so I left the Royal Free, and
What year was that?
I left in 2001, November of 2001.
You stayed in the UK?
I was in the UK at that time, travelling backwards and forwards to the States, where the story was exactly the same as I'd heard in the UK, as I'd heard in Canada, as I'd heard in Europe, exactly the same story. And I'd been introduced to the Dan community at that stage, and had talked for the first time and met Bernie Rimland, and realised how pervasive this problem was, and how rapidly it was growing.
Dan is short for Defeat Autism Now.
Defeat Autism Now, that's right. One of the pioneers in the medical field of autism. In other words, taking autism from the psychological and behavioural and putting it firmly in the this is a medical disorder camp, was Bernie Rimland, the late Bernie Rimland. So he was a fine man, and someone who had a big influence upon where I went and what I did with my career. And so I initially looked at helping set up a centre in Florida, and then finally settled on Austin, Texas, which has a tremendous community spirit. And
so that's where you live now, in Austin?
In Austin, yeah.
And then you came over to the United States in what year?
I started
to live here permanently.
I started to live here in about 2005.
2005. So you've been here for 5 years now.
5 years, yeah.
Okay. And is there anything else that happened in that time frame that occurred prior to what the recent media attention you've received?
Well, that was the beginning of the media attention. In 2004, I suddenly got this contact from freelance journalist Brian Deere, working on behalf of the Sunday Times, making a whole series of allegations against my colleagues and I. In his opinion, these children did not need investigation. In his opinion, these children did not need a colonoscopy or a lumbar puncture or these other investigations that my clinical colleagues had deemed they most certainly did need.
And he had no formal medical training?
None at all.
Just
none at all, but it was his opinion.
Yeah.
And he believed that I had got together with a lawyer, had rounded up these children for the purpose of creating a legal case against the manufacturers of the vaccine in order to bring about the downfall of the vaccine, in order to launch my own vaccine onto the market. That's a great story. That's a great story.
And it was, if he had done his homework, he would have found that it was impossible because the manufacturers were indemnified.
Yeah. Well, it was just so fanciful. Where do you start to unpick a story like that? But the bizarre thing is that what mutated from that original story, none of which really made any sense. The children were not involved in litigation when they were referred to the Royal Free. They were nothing to do with litigation until afterwards. They were not herded, rounded up by lawyers. They didn't come from lawyers. These are parents who heard about the work or read about the work or had been talking to friends at child groups who made spontaneous contact with me because in the newspapers they'd seen the work on Crohn's disease. That's how they came. So he made so many factual errors, but he nonetheless managed to persuade the General Medical Council to initiate a process of investigation against us. And by that stage, this had become such a political hot potato. The Minister of Health, that a number of people from the department had put their oar in and decided this needed to be investigated, that they construed this case against us. And we, that is my colleagues and I, have recently been found guilty of some of the most ludicrous charges by, for example, experimenting on children in the absence of ethical approval. So they determined that the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist was not fit to determine whether these children needed a colonoscopy or not for clinical indications. They determined it was research.
Well, was this a physician council that made that determination, or?
There were three physicians and 2 lay members.
And is that the recent?
That's right.
Okay,
That's
so
right.
maybe you can get us up to the details that led to that and summarize what the process was. And that was sort of a part of the conclusion, a rebuttal, but I think there's probably a bit more to the story.
Oh,
so.
Joe, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. Let me characterize it by one example. In medicine, as you know, communication is essential. Mm-hmm. Communication is the key.
Mm-hmm.
Doctors to doctor, doctor to patient, patient to doctor.
Well, as a tangent aside, most physicians are trained, if they should be trained, that the primary reason for most malpractice suits are lack of communication. That is the reason why most all physicians are sued.
Right. So what happened is when the parents called me with this highly complex story, I couldn't help them, but I knew someone who could, and that was John Walker Smith. So I said, you need to get a referral from your doctor, your family doctor, to Professor Walker Smith.
And was he a physician?
He's a physician. He's the professor of pediatric gastroenterology. In fact, he's probably the founding father of the discipline of pediatric gastroenterology worldwide.
He's still alive?
He's still alive. Okay. A very eminent doctor who was a co-defendant at the GMC. Okay. So I recommended that the parents seek a referral to him. That is my communication to them, signposting them to a doctor who might help their child. I also offered, because of the complexity of the whole story, to talk to their doctor, the family doctor, if it would help to communicate what we were thinking in terms of how the gut and the brain might be linked, and what we might be able to do in terms of Professor Walker Smith's clinical input, my research input, to help this child. And that offer was on the table. So some doctors contacted me, some parents put me in contact with the doctors, and I spoke to them. I communicated to them. And the referrals were made accordingly or not. At the GMC, I was found guilty of causing children to have, for example, lumbar punctures, spinal taps, because of this communication. Now that's got to be a completely new charge. Causing children to have these tests. I didn't do the tests, I wasn't there when the tests were done, I didn't prescribe the tests. But I caused the children to have them because the parents called me and I suggested getting a referral to Walker Smith. And that is how complex and how bizarre and how tortuous this process has become.
And these were the findings that came out this year.
That's right.
Yes. Just a few months ago, actually. Yeah. So what are some of the other results of that? Or maybe is there some other, can you discuss some of the charges that were, other charges that were
certainly. The principal charge, the principal finding against us is that we had investigated these children without ethics committee approval. We'd undertaken, or a series of investigations had been undertaken on these children without ethics committee approval. Now, firstly, let me make it absolutely clear that tests that are clinically indicated are not research, and they do not require the approval of a hospital ethics committee. They're just like you going to the doctor saying, wow, you've got a bad throat, I'm going to take a blood sample to see if you've got streptitis. That is a clinical test, and my clinical colleagues were perfectly capable of making the decision about those clinical tests. But the GMC argued that those were research tests. They weren't. They also argued that the research tests were not covered under an ethical approval. That also was false. What they'd failed to identify in their due diligence was that there was an existing ethical approval for the research elements that were undertaken in the Lancet paper. And that was work that I did, and that was related to a detailed microscopic examination of the tissues in the children. So they were wrong on both counts. They'd called clinical tests research tests, wrong, and they'd said there was no ethical approval for the research tests that formed part of the Lancet paper, wrong also. So the major conviction against me, against my two colleagues, was that there were tests being done that were research that didn't have ethical approval, and they were wrong on both counts.
Well, it's somewhat shocking to believe that that they could come to that conclusion. I mean, surely you had an opportunity to provide this information to them, and they can listen to it. There are 3 physicians, 2 lay people. I mean, how could any rational, logical individual come to that conclusion? It doesn't make sense. It's just an irrational response. Do you have any theories or understandings as to why this conclusion was reached, or this verdict?
I think that there are 2 possibilities, 2 broadly. They didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
They rarely get confronted with research issues, and they were unable to distinguish between research and clinical. It was beyond their remit. They did not get it. Alternatively, there was pressure on them to find us guilty. Now, I don't like to believe that that's the case. I don't like to believe that they acquiesce to any kind of external pressure from the government to find us guilty. I really hope that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
I like to believe that there is still justice and there is still fair-mindedness. But I will never know, I suspect.
At least in the peer review process. But that's an interesting tangent to this peer review process, because as part of this conviction, your paper, your initial original paper that was published in The Lancet in '89, that started this whole process, was actually removed. I don't even know if that's been done before, but it was removed. And you explained to me earlier today some very interesting details that I don't think anyone knows about. So why don't we go into some of these details, because I think it'll be enlightening for the world to hear this.
All right. Well, the paper was originally underwent a partial retraction in 2004.
Okay.
What does that mean? It meant that the editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, asked that we issue a partial retraction of the interpretation that MMR vaccine causes autism. Well, we had never provided that interpretation. And is it a possibility? Yes. Can you retract a possibility? No. It's totally illogical. So many of my colleagues, who I think were quite frightened by this whole process, decided to issue a partial retraction. 3 of us said no.
How many colleagues were involved in
There were 13.
13.
And 10 retracted and 3 said no. This doesn't make any sense scientifically. You can't retract a possibility. We did not come to the conclusion that the vaccine causes autism, quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
So no, we're not going to get involved in this. When the final decision came at the GMC, principally that there wasn't ethical committee approval for this study, then Dr. Horton decided to completely retract the paper, even though it was a clinical case series that did not need ethical approval for the tests that were done clinically. Again, totally illogical, but allowed Dr. Horton to put further clear blue water between him and this paper. And there's no doubt, by his own admission in his various books, he had been the subject of severe criticism for publishing this paper in the first place. So he was able to gain some redemption by removing the paper from the written record. So what we were left with then is a situation where this paper, these children, the reality of the bowel disease, the existence of these children, their demise after the MMR vaccine was effectively removed from the record. Does that make any difference? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. That's just political posturing. Does it actually mean these children didn't exist, that their problems weren't real, that they didn't regress after the vaccine? No. In fact, I think what has happened is it's alienated a great number of the scientific and medical community, because it's just a piece of Big Brother. It's just censorship trying to deal with dissent against the possibility that vaccines are not as safe as they've been purported to be. And so it's interesting, therefore, that when you look at The Lancet, it's owned by Elsevier, the publisher's Elsevier, and there's been a very interesting article on Age of Autism which looks at the links between Elsevier's chairman and his board position on GlaxoSmithKline.
And Elsevier is a massive publisher, perhaps the largest publisher of medical journals in the world. I mean, they have hundreds of different journals that they publish, Lancet being one of them.
Yeah. Which brings us to the next point, which we were also discussing earlier, is we subsequently published a paper in another Elsevier journal, that is Neurotoxicology. And this was part of a long, long study It's interesting, and I'll just go into the background very briefly. It's a study that should have been done years ago. When you do vaccine safety studies, they are very often done in primates, non-human primates, before they go into children. And the rhesus macaque, an old world monkey, is one of those primates. And so we decided some years ago, 8 or so years ago, to do the study that had never been done, to take the vaccine schedule. What happens in the real world? If we expose these infant primates to what kids get between the age of day 1 and preschool boosters, the vaccine schedule in the 1990s with thimerosal in it, what's the outcome? What's the outcome in terms of their development, in terms of their cognition, in terms of their intestinal function, in terms of their immune function, brain imaging, all those kinds of things. A very, very detailed study. And it should have been done. It was never done. It had never been done. Extraordinary. Parents might expect that the total vaccine schedule that their children are going to get has been looked at for safety in toto. It has not. The individual vaccines are looked at, but the schedule is not. So we decided we'd do this study. The first paper just looked at the effect of the thimerosal, the mercury-containing hepatitis B vaccine, on day 1, and looking at the acquisition of essential reflexes like feeding reflexes. And we compared them with unvaccinated animals, animals that had been given saline as a control. And what we found is there was a significant delay in the acquisition of these basic life-saving reflexes in the recipients of the vaccine as early as the first few days of life. Very, very worrying. We published that paper. It went through rigorous peer review. It was published online in neurotoxicology, and then lo and behold, after the GMC decision, they decided not to proceed to publication in the paper itself. The paper was withdrawn. Not based upon its clinical, its scientific merits. It had been through the process of peer review that you and I talked about, a process that we recognize as absolutely essential to the conduct of science. It had been through that. It had been published, and then it was withdrawn. Yes, I think people can draw their own conclusions from this, but we all have our own opinions. But the fact is that when a colleague of mine contacted the journal's editor to say, why has this happened, the journal editor directed that person to Elsevier. Now this is extraordinary. Had it been withdrawn for a scientific reason, the editor would have been able to deal with it. But it was not withdrawn for a scientific reason. The contact was directed by the editor to Elsevier itself. So this was a decision that had come from the top, from the publishers. And as I said before, we now know that Elsevier and GlaxoSmithKline have this common denominator, this link in the chairman of Elsevier.
Huge potential for conflict of interest.
Huge potential for conflict of interest, should be disclosed, and something which shouldn't, and one hopes it didn't, influence the decision to withdraw that paper. But the important factor is that it was a decision taken by the publishing company and not by the editor, the scientific editor of the journal itself.
And this is the drug company that actually manufactured the vaccine that was removed from the UK after 4 years of causing these increased incidents of meningitis as a result of the contamination.
That's correct.
So an interesting point of information that has really not been exposed prior to now. So one of your biggest critics in the United States is Dr. Paul Offit, who's recognized as one of the leading advocates for vaccine, actually not just vaccinations, but mandatory vaccinations, compulsory vaccinations, which essentially eliminates the freedom of choice of a parent to decide for themselves whether or not they choose to give their children this vaccine. So, and this is actually the same physician, Dr. Offit, who has a huge potential for conflict of interest because he's generated millions of dollars from developing his own vaccine, a rotavirus vaccine. And interestingly, one of the other rotavirus vaccines was just recently found to be contaminated with pig virus, and that's another side issue. But this is Dr. Offit has been noted to say that it is safe and to not expect any side effects from giving an innocent infant child 10,000 vaccines on one day, vaccinations. It is just profoundly absurd to think that anyone can make that statement, let alone someone who's purported to be an expert in vaccines. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that, on his comment, I guess. you want to think about for a bit. But
no, I'm very happy to talk about it. It's something that's given me cause for concern. So let's just put Dr. Offit in the frame. And in saying what I'm going to say, I have offered on several occasions by recorded delivery mail to debate Dr. Offit in public at any time in any place of his choosing, and that he has never taken me up on, and I don't suppose that he's going to. Let's just characterize Dr. Offit's sense of proportion and due diligence in what he says. For example, in his book about false prophets, autism and false prophets, he claimed that I had made the recommendation to use single vaccines in the UK in February 1998 when the single vaccines were not available. They were. I would not have made the recommendation had they not been. If you Google that, if you put in withdrawal single vaccines UK into Google, the first website that comes up gives you the precise date on which they were withdrawn in the fall of that year, 6 months beyond what I had said. That's all Dr. Offit had to do to check his facts. That's all he had to do. He did not do it. Instead, he decided to go into his book, go into print, and defame me by suggesting that I would make a recommendation which was, in effect, unethical. So that is a measure, if you like, of Dr. Offit's application to the task at hand. Now we come to your specific question about the use of 10,000, which I think he's now revised to 100,000 vaccine antigens on one day. And this is based upon a theoretical study that he did looking at the sort of genetic variability of the genes responsible for antibody production, and saying, well, based upon the number that we have available, we should be able to produce this number of antibodies. That is an entirely theoretical, mathematical piece of jiggery-pokery. It has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the real world, and it's bizarre that he would go out there and say that, and that really, really worries me from a safety standpoint. If you just take, for example, MMR, and you add in the varicella vaccine, the chickenpox vaccine, MMRV, as proquad, what happens is you double the rate of convulsions as an adverse reaction. So just adding one in, not 999,000, but just one extra vaccine in, you double the rate of a potentially serious adverse reaction, to the extent that that proquad vaccine had to be withdrawn. So the notion that you could give a child 100,000 vaccine antigens on one day is utter nonsense. And what is extraordinary, what is telling, I suppose, is that no other immunologist or vaccinologist or any other person with any credible standing has stood behind Dr. Offit and said, yes, you can, go for it. Well, the thing that really worries me, Joe, is that there is a tendency, and it's a public relations exercise, to separate this into pro and anti-vaccine. It's much easier for Paul Offit to call us anti-vaccine than it is to engage in the debate. I am not anti-vaccine at all. In fact, ironically, it is people who are putting the safety first agenda, a safety first vaccine agenda, not profit or policy, but safety first vaccine agenda, who will ultimately be the saviors of vaccine policy in this country and around the world. Because vaccine policy, as you know, depends upon public confidence. And if the public lose confidence in people like Dr. Offit, which is a real risk, then they will withdraw from vaccines altogether, across the board. And that will lead to the resurgence of infectious disease and problems. Now, vaccines are imperfect, and there needs to be a safety-first agenda that optimizes the safety of those vaccines above any other issue, that puts the health of children first. And so you have this situation where those who are driving the safety-first agenda are in fact the ones who will preserve public confidence in the long run, rather than destroy it by making extraordinary statements like you can give a child 100,000 vaccine antigens on the same day. And that in the end will be the downfall of this program.
And one of the major organizations in the United States is the NVIC, the National Vaccine Information Center, run by Barbara Lowe Fisher. And she has been promoting this for over 25 years. It's essentially a volunteer organization run on a shoestring budget, and really been preaching the message of vaccine safety first. They're not anti-vaccine by any way, shape, or form. And yet, interestingly, The Lancet just wrote an editorial or an article about the anti-vaccine people or movements, and characterized her as one of the leading organizations in this movement. And one of the arguments that they gave against this, and essentially a proof that they are making some negative results of the public listening to them, is that there's been a relative increase in the measles and mumps, the incidence of measles and mumps, as a result of people listening to this message and choosing not to vaccinate. So the results, the incidence of vaccination has gone down, the incidence of these diseases have gone up. And I'm wondering if you can, that seems to be their central argument as a justification that the organizations that are proponents of vaccine safety are having a negative public health impact. And eventually they're going to use this as some type of justification to implement mandatory vaccination. So I wonder if you can address that, because that seems to be the main argument.
It's a very important issue. Let's just break that argument down.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take measles first. Has there been a resurgence of measles in the UK? Yes, there have been some more cases. How might that have come about? You'll remember that I recommended the use of single vaccines. In February 1998, I recommended urged the use of single vaccines. 6 months, 7 months later, the government withdrew the importation license. Therefore, that option was taken away from parents. So parents who were not anti-vaccine were having a major option taken away from them for how to protect their children when they had genuine safety concerns about MMR. Concerns which were engendered in the fact that a few years earlier one had had to be withdrawn for safety reasons. So they were perfectly justified in being concerned. So the government removes the option, and lo and behold, what happens? Measles comes back. So who is to blame for the resurgence of measles? They're putting protection of the policy before protection of children. Let's come to mumps now. Mumps is extremely interesting. Mumps, in this country, in the US, the CDC did a study when Maurice Hilleman went from Merck, the head of vaccines at Merck, went to the CDC and
who's
said,
since passed away.
I have a mumps vaccine. I would like you to use it. They did a study and they said there is no need. Mumps is a trivial disease in children. We do not need this vaccine. Exactly the same happened in the UK. The Department of Health, the Medicines Control Agency, the regulators in the UK said, this is a trivial disease in children. We do not need a mumps vaccine. But it got in. It got in, and there's a story behind this that will be published in a book by Patrick Tierney that will be coming out sometime later, hopefully this year. And what they did is they got the vaccine into the program. Now, the problem has been that the mumps vaccine does not work. It does not protect enough people in the first instance, and those that it does protect, the protection does not last. Now, they foresaw this problem. They said one of the big problems with the mumps vaccine...
And the day is Merck.
This is Merck in this country, and this was SmithKline in the UK.
Okay.
The mumps vaccine, the antibody levels, the protection levels fall off very quickly. Mm-hmm. And they had anticipated this. They said, here's the problem. If the vaccine does not work, it's called secondary failure, the antibody levels falling off, the protection diminishing over time, then we are turning a trivial disease in children into a potentially more dangerous disease in adults. Because you and I know, and people out there know, that mumps in adult males can cause testicular inflammation and sterility. It can cause other problems.
Orchitis, yes.
Orchitis.
Yeah.
So there was the risk. If they introduce this vaccine, is there going to be a long-term problem because they're taking a trivial disease and turning it into a more dangerous disease? That is exactly what's happened. So we're now seeing outbreaks of mumps in highly vaccinated populations. Populations of people who've received not one but 2 doses and more, because reboosting them with another vaccine doesn't work.
So that's a very important point. I wonder if you can just review that again. So the suggestion is that if you have a population that is not vaccinated, their likelihood of getting mumps as an adult is much lower than a population that was.
That's right, because if they've caught it as children, they've caught it infants, they've had a mild, trivial dose of mumps, they develop lifelong immunity, and therefore they are immune.
So the natural immunity that they would typically get in a community that hadn't been vaccinated is going to be far superior and essentially eliminate the only known dangerous complication of mumps, which is just testicular inflammation and swelling, which can lead to infertility.
I mean, there are other problems as well,
Well,
like
that's the major
pancreatitis, but that's absolutely, this is the major one. So you have effectively taken a trivial disease and by vaccinating, you've turned it into a more dangerous disease. Now they're in a real mess. They're in a real mess because 1 dose of MMR doesn't prevent it, 2 doses of MMR don't prevent it, 3 doses. You are creating a population that is dependent upon reboosting with vaccines for the rest of their lives to avoid this complication, a man-made complication.
And isn't that convenient? And isn't that perhaps the model that they're using to have this create a problem with the very solution that they're proposing that requires continuous use of that solution, which massively and exponentially increases their profits?
Well, it would be
because the demand for the solution goes through the roof. And this is just one disease, mumps. This hasn't even been studied for the other diseases and all the ones that are in the pipeline.
Yes. I tend to, was there a conspiracy to anticipate that? I don't know. You never substitute conspiracy for incompetence. I think they made a huge error.
That's a good point.
There was incompetence.
Yeah.
They were incompetent. They were so zealous, so urgently needed to get this vaccine into the market that they ignored the potential problems. And now we have a big problem. Mumps vaccine is a dangerous vaccine. It does not work.
It's hard to imagine that there was incompetence in the drug companies. I mean, certainly in the regulatory agencies. They may not have looked at it carefully, thought it through, but the drug companies are the ones that are going to benefit from the increased use of this. And maybe they didn't know at the time. I guess they could give them the benefit of the doubt, but they're certainly the ones that are benefiting.
I think there's no doubt that if you create a population that's dependent upon boosting and boosting and boosting on a regular basis with vaccines, your volume of sales is going to go up dramatically. So there's benefit. I think that my concern is that this madness has to be curtailed. It has to be stopped. There has to be an injection of common sense into the whole regulatory process. And it's not there at the moment. It's not there. And we're seeing mumps epidemics occurring all around the developed world as a consequence of this. So, and blaming it on Barbara Loe Fisher and NVIC is utter nonsense.
Are there any other diseases that are similar to mumps that you can see or predict or project that may be an issue coming down the road?
I think the one that concerns me most is, in that respect, is chickenpox. I have real concerns about a chickenpox vaccine that may produce the same effects, because chickenpox, for the great majority of children, is a mild disease.
Similar to mumps.
Similar to mumps. Chickenpox in adults is not. Chickenpox in adults can be an extremely severe disease, producing inflammation of the brain, major problems. So if you are, again, displacing the age of susceptibility to an older age because you vaccinated and the vaccine does not work over a long period, then you've got major problems. And there are other issues with chickenpox vaccine that go beyond that. We're now seeing shingles in children. We're seeing shingles in adults because they're not getting the natural re-exposure in the community to children who are infected with chickenpox, that natural boosting of immunity over time. Excuse me. So if I were to single out a vaccine that I would be particularly concerned about and certainly deserves long-term study, it would be the chickenpox vaccine.
Okay, so another concern, certainly one of my most significant concerns, is the absolute ludicrous insanity of recommending that a child, a newborn, harmless, innocent child, be given hepatitis B vaccine on the day they were born. And this isn't a disease that is really only blood-borne, so it'd have to be by getting a transfusion, or through having sexual intercourse. There's no really other known routes of exposure except from getting it from the mother, which is easily, if they were that concerned about it, they could just do a blood test and find out if the mother has it, and then if she does, then you can give the child the vaccine. But that's not being done. It's being done routine. So most of the newborns in this country, even unknown to the parents, well, the child is taken away and in the nursery is given the shot, but they're not even asked. So to me, this is insanity, and actually, needs. If you're vigilant about it, you can refuse it, but you have to be very, very careful and know that beforehand. So I'm wondering if you can comment on hepatitis B.
This is a huge issue. I mean, quite apart from the fact you could make a very good case for hepatitis B immunization, given the endemic nature of this disease and the high mortality and morbidity worldwide, coming down to the specific issue.
And you're particularly, I mean, your training is in gastroenterology, so you're particularly qualified to address this.
Coming down to the issue of giving it on day one of life, there are several issues that surround that. The first is when we did this primate study, giving that hepatitis B vaccine on day one, we looked for the safety studies of that policy. What had been done to establish the safety of giving it on day one? Not just giving it on day one, but giving it on day one to every infant, whether they were born at 24 weeks, or 30 weeks, or 36 weeks, or 40 weeks, whatever their their birth weight was, whether they were 10 pounds, or 3 pounds, or 2 pounds, they were getting the same shot day one as a matter of policy. Safety studies?
Non-existent.
We couldn't find them. And that was really, really shocking. Really shocking. How could this be? If you're going to make a case for it, if you're going to do it, if you're going to make it a matter of policy for every kid in the country, then you've got to be absolutely certain that you've got the safety studies right. Because if not, you may produce insidious problems, minor degrees of damage, which you don't pick up straight away, but are catastrophic later on. So you better make sure you've done the homework, and they hadn't.
And
so
they still haven't.
They still haven't. And so this is a real source of concern to me. Then you come to the other issues that you raised, and that is, it's the hospital policy. So here is a mother who's just been through 24, 48 hours of labor, is absolutely exhausted, is not in a position to give informed consent, is simply not in a position to do it. They're not even asked in many cases. As you say, the child is just taken away because it's policy. Now this has got to stop. That is criminal assault, and that has got to stop. There has got to be some degree of legal control over that process, because that mother is not in a position to give fully informed consent, and is often, as you point out, never asked. So there are separate issues here, one about the safety profiling of this whole process, and the other is about the policy issue that surrounds how it's done.
Informed consent. It really is a central right that we all have, that has been taken away for us, not even told that we've lost it, and not even aware.
Yeah, and with the word informed consent, it's an oxymoron. To be able to give informed consent, you have to have the information to give. If the safety information does not exist, you're not in a position to give that information. So the process of informed consent never gets out of the starting blocks.
It's a good way to look at it as an oxymoron. If the data's not there, how can any parent possibly know the potential complications? They can't. It's just not known. And that's really been, the NVIC's primary position is to push the vaccine safety first. We've got to do these safety studies. So I appreciate your comments on informed consent. And interestingly, one of the if you can call it a benefit, but one of the benefits that did come out of World War II is that we had the Nuremberg trials where the atrocities in Germany were addressed, and we developed the Nuremberg Code, which really had this whole aspect on informed consent to give, because that was one of the atrocities that occurred. They were performing these experiments on humans, and what the code essentially developed was that it's unethical to perform these trials without informed voluntary consent. And interestingly, Dr. Offit, as I mentioned earlier, is really a very strong proponent of mandatory vaccinations for the benefit of the public health, because the risk or the benefits outweigh the risk. and which is really preposterous in light of the information you've just shared, because we just don't even know what the risks are because the studies haven't even been done. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Sure. Just as a sort of reflection on the General Medical Council, I was called unethical, and I just wanted to make the point that, as you say, ethics is about fully informed consent, truly informed consent, and I have never done anything without informed consent. So I have adhered to the ethical codes throughout, and it's particularly alarming to hear talk about mandatory vaccination. Mandatory vaccination. Mandatory vaccination itself is a reflection of the failure of the process. If you have to mandate a vaccination, if you have not got the will of the people, if you have not got the confidence of the people in your vaccination policy, and therefore you have to mandate it, you have to coerce people, you have to threaten them with not going to school or no welfare, social welfare, then you have failed. You have completely failed in your aim to gain the confidence of the public in your public health policy. So it's a reflection, ironically, of the failure of the system, the need to mandate the process. And I am completely and utterly against the idea that you can take the rights of the parent away for the care of their child, for the decisions made in the context of what their child should and shouldn't have, and hand them over to the state. One of the most telling cases I ever came across was a mother at a meeting, mother of an autistic child, and her job had been, as a nurse, to take the children who had been made wards of court because their parents wouldn't vaccinate them, and vaccinate those children, to forcibly vaccinate those children, to take them from their parents and give them the shot because their parents had voluntarily decided not to, and the government had intervened and determined that it had the rights. And what had happened to her, in the cruelest of ironies, is that her child had regressed after a vaccine and become profoundly autistic. And she has to live with that knowledge for the rest of her life, that she did that she was part of that system that encouraged, that endorsed that process, which is more reminiscent of Stalinist Russia than it is of latter-day America.
Well, and I think that also brings up the point of really the challenge we have in this country, where you have probably one of the best disciplines, pediatricians, and really one of the lowest paid, really the incredibly motivated, dedicated individuals. I mean, there's just no question that is reflective of the majority of these pediatricians. And yet they're so firmly committed to this process, to the point where they almost become violent if someone opposes them. And yet, for them to seriously reflect on the possibility that they might be causing harm is so massively abhorrent to them, they can't even consider it. It's just not something they can objectively review. I think it's the same issue. And really one of the challenges that we have is to have them overcome that, because they would be admitting that the bulk of what they're doing is actually causing more harm, potentially causing more harm than good.
Yes. I feel extremely sorry and concerned for pediatricians as a group, in as much that they have been driven down a path, largely by the insurance industry, where they'll be remunerated for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a brief consult, and within that time you've almost got your pen in your hand to write the script or to give the vaccine, and so you're dependent, in order to make an adequate living, on getting information from the CDC, from the AAP, from all of these people, and believing in that information and acting on that information, but not being in a position to go away and assimilate it yourself. And I don't believe that. I think that if people were really concerned, they would actually go and read these papers and come to their own determination of what was right and what was wrong, and what to believe and what not to believe. And an example of this was we wrote a paper recently in response to Dr. Ari Brown, who is a proponent of vaccines and a spokesman for the Immunization Action Coalition, which was utter nonsense. It was a vox pop. It was written for the people. It was to explain why vaccines are safe, but it was, I'm afraid, factually totally inaccurate and scientifically bereft of any common sense at all. And when we wrote a response to this, Does that get out to the pediatricians? Do they see that? Is that the leaflet parents pick up when they go into the doctors? No, but it should be, because that is truly the essence of informed consent, is to look at the pros and the cons.
Well, and that is the mission of, one of the missions of our site, is to provide this information, because clearly the media is not. And I think we have an example of what we've done last year. We were one of the primary reasons why there was such a massive refusal, at least in the United States and worldwide, of this swine flu vaccine that was purported to be the solution for this massive pandemic, which was actually one of the mildest flu seasons in history. So the central issue is that and I think really the point of to take home is that we can make a difference, is that if we know this information, if we can share this with their friends and families, and that they know that there is a valid scientific justification for making these choices, then that word can get out. And that because we have these, I mean, that's what they wrote this article was written in The Lancet, because they're afraid of what we're doing, that we are educating the masses, that there is an option, that there is a valid scientific reason to be concerned, because the appropriate studies have not been done. So the more information we get out, the more we can spread the word, the likelier we are to have a change in policy that is rational and makes sense. It's not that we're opposed to vaccines. We just need to do these safely and soundly and make sense. It's not going to hurt us in the long term.
Yeah.
So I think it's something to be encouraged about, that we are making a difference. And through really the work of pioneers like yourselves, who really, you know, you've gotten a lot of arrows in your back, and we are so grateful for all the work that you've been done, for the really, you've taken a hit for so many of us. And, you know, you've really been personally challenged to the point where, you know, they're discrediting you publicly, you're humiliated, you had to move to this country and leave your position, which is a prestigious position. I mean, you've really taken a hit for the lives, and, you know, there's going to be millions of people who are going to benefit from what you've done. So our mission is really to take what you've done, spread and share that, so more people will know that there's really some truth here that they're not being informed about.
Well, Joe, I really appreciate that. I had just kind of a couple of things in closing, and that is that it doesn't matter what happens to me. It's irrelevant. You know, I decided this, when you go down this path, you decide this a long time ago, is that this story was written before you and I were ever born. This is the history of medicine. If you look at thalidomide, the first doctor, an obstetrician in Australia, McBride, who described thalidomide in The Lancet, interestingly, was struck off. He was struck off. The drug companies went after him, and his research was criticized, and the details don't matter, but the process is there. And in Australia too, when the Merck Vioxx trials were going on recently, there was a disclosure of internal memos in Merck about how to deal with doctors who dissented from the safety of Vioxx. And it was about isolating, discrediting, and the last one said, we may have to seek them out and destroy them where they live. So this is what medicine has in store for it if it calls into question the safety of a company's drugs. And when I was interviewed on NBC, although this didn't make it off the cutting room floor, I was asked if I was just into conspiracy theory, and I said, this is not conspiracy theory, this is more like corporate policy. So the other thing to say is, you know, this pro-anti-vaccine argument, it's interesting, there was a recall of Toyota cars recently because there were safety concerns about jamming of the gas pedal. Were the people who called for the withdrawal of those cars anti-car? I don't think so. They weren't anti-car at all. They were concerned about people crashing and dying on the freeway. So that doesn't make them anti-car. And so dichotomizing this argument into pro and anti-vaccine makes no sense at all. Absolutely none.
That's a very good analogy, and one that's really obvious for anyone to see.
Yeah, and finally, you know, you would think that this community that's been beaten up and impoverished and is surrounded by all these experts who are telling them that they're wrong would go away. They're not going to go away. These parents aren't going to go away. The children aren't going to go away. And there was a recent study, I think it was from the University of Michigan, after everything that had happened, all the millions that had been spent on public relations, all the kicking and brutalizing of physicians who get involved in this, all of the discrediting, 1 in 4 parents believe that vaccines cause autism. In other words, Joe, they've lost. They've lost the public relations war. We've done nothing. From our side, this is the first time I've spoken about it. You and I are sitting here for the first time. We have done nothing. Our expenditure on public relations, 0. 1 in 4 parents in this country. Why? The answer is very simple. Because it's real. Because it's real.
It's the truth.
That's the truth. And no amount of public relations, coercion, vilification is going to change that.
Or presidential mandates.
No. So I'm afraid that they either take notice of the fact that 1 in 4 parents believe vaccines cause autism. This isn't a cross-section of the population. Those 1 in 4 tend to be the intelligentsia, the educated, the professional, the people who listen and talk and read. So this is not a reflection, this is a real problem for the system. And if the system does not acknowledge that and take notice of it, then it is going to be in real trouble, because now the fight back begins. And what's that 1 in 4 going to become?
Okay, so at this point you're through the General Medical Council and the massive media exposure and that, and you are living in Austin, you're doing, and I'm just wondering if you can tell our viewers what you're doing at this point. Are you conducting research? Do you have any books in process, or what's your next step at this point?
Well, I've got the opportunity now to get the story out there. So there is a book, I've written a book. When at the GMC I was accused of callous disregard for children suffering, which is rather extraordinary even to me, having experienced what I've experienced. To be accused of callous disregard for children is a stretch. So the book is called Callous Disregard, and there's just a tinge of irony in that. And it's really about the circumstances that surrounded the Lancet paper and everything that flowed from it, but also the whistleblower in the background and that behind-the-scenes action that I wasn't aware of at the time, but was forced into the open by the disclosures at the General Medical Council. So it's a story that hasn't been told that needs to be told. The second part of it, which I'm writing at the moment, which will focus largely on the American experience and my involvement with congressional testimony and that kind of thing, and all the behind-the-scenes jiggery-pokery that went on there. So that book will be coming out hopefully in time for Autism One here in Chicago in late May. So,
okay, so you expect to have your book published before May of this year?
Yes, that's the plan. And it's just to get the story out there and put the other side. And if people want to involve themselves in this debate and to discuss this, then read that book, understand it. And if you're not interested, don't. But if you're interested in this, if you're really genuinely interested in the background, this whole issue and the role of vaccines in this problem, then get informed.
Okay. And at this point, you're still conducting research in Austin?
Yes. What I've just been offered a new position which allows me to integrate the research efforts of a variety of autism organizations around the world, and to focus on those issues that the Interagency Coordinating Committee, with all its money and all its power, seems to be loath to do, and that is to look directly at environmental causes. Included within that, of course, is vaccines. So the IACC seems to be moving around that issue, but the elephant in the room is clearly the vaccines. They don't want to look at it. Now, my concern is to rule it in or rule it out. If they're fine, they're fine. If they're not, they're not. We need to know. The public need to know. The medical profession needs to know, so that we can make informed choices and give informed consent.
Terrific. So at this point, I'm assuming the offer to Dr. Offit to publicly debate him in any way, shape, or form is still open. And hopefully he'll take you up on that, because it would be a delight to see, and I can assure you we would widely publicize that, because we have nothing, and you have nothing to hide here, and I just don't think he's going to do that anytime soon. But hopefully that offer is still open, and I want to thank you for the time for this interview. Thank you for all you've been doing in your life's work and will continue to do, and for really making a dent, making a difference for these, for all the people who really don't have the opportunity within your skill sets and training to really expose the truth on this really important topic.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Well, thank you.
Great to be here.
Well, I want to thank you for watching this interview with Dr. Wakefield. I know it was long, but there's a lot of great, important information. You may even want to watch it again to get some of the hidden information in there. But I think you can begin to understand that the central theme here is one of vaccine safety. It's clear that Dr. Wakefield is not opposed to vaccination, but he is opposed to unsafe vaccine practices. And the real challenge is that most of these vaccines and the vaccine schedules have not been studied. They just haven't been looked at. And we will be continuing to provide you with more information. We're going to work collaboratively with Dr. Wakefield, who's actually still actively doing research and involved with some primate studies and seeking to replicate some models that will either prove or disprove vaccine safety, and it will be published in some of the peer-reviewed journals. So as that research gets published, we're going to bring it to your attention and let you know, give you the information you're going to need, because remember, informed consent is not informed if you don't have the information. So really the intention of this is twofold. One is to give you the information, but also to provide another model that the FDA will incorporate and adopt so they can sequentially test these vaccines, so that when they are suggesting a new vaccine, that vaccine is not tested in isolation. That vaccine is tested in a format that the way it's going to be used. So it's going to be used with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other vaccines, perhaps at the same time. So that's the only way that we're going to see if there's not some synergistic toxicity with the application of multiple vaccines. So this is the model that we're seeking to change in the whole vaccine system. So it's really the adoption of a well-studied scientific method that is going to bring illumination to this area. So we're just, again, delighted that you watched, and we're just very excited to be able to work with Dr. Wakefield to bring you this information. So stay tuned, and we'll continue to provide you with the most current information we can on this topic.